Thank you, Plowman. I just got a message telling me that my connection is unstable. If you experience any problems, please let me know and I will switch to a mobile connection, which may be a good alternative. Now, this is based on an article that myself and these authors that you see have published, submitted for publication. It hasn't been published yet. We got a relatively positive first round of 5 reviews, although some of the reviewers seem to be definitely opposed to what we say in this article, but it seems that some are also quite positive. So if the article is accepted by the journal where we submitted it, it will be followed by commentaries by various experts in various fields. So we hope that we will stimulate an interesting debate. So basically, this is about differences in comparing the minds of individuals from different countries and whole societies, and why the methods used for these 2 different types of comparisons cannot be exactly the same. They may be somewhat similar, but they also have their specificities. And I have to specify that some of the views expressed in this particular presentation may differ from those in the article, so they may be my own views. Not everything that I'm going to say has been agreed with all of my co-authors. We say in the article that cross-cultural research in social and behavioral sciences is plagued by tension and methodological disagreements due to a lack of appreciation of the differences between cross-cultural psychology and what we call comparative culturology, CC, the field created by Hofstede and then developed further by Schwartz and Engelhardt and many other scholars. So starting from very narrow issues, such as whether or not to test for invariance in cross-cultural studies, which we consider relatively minor issues, and our reviewers and the editor agree, we arrive at something much bigger. Words of the specificities of the research interests of what we call comparative culturology. Now, this is an example from the article. Our field does not usually study individual patterns. Imagine a fictitious country in which the population is represented by 10 legislators. Each of them represents 10% of the legislators. And these voters, the views of the voters are consistent with the views of the legislators. Now, the legislators have to vote on 3 bills: an abortion bill, divorce, and same-sex marriage. And they vote in the following way. 1 stands for in favor, 0 stands for against. What is the pattern at the individual level? We don't see a coherent pattern. We see that 2 of the items correlated minus 67 and another 2 at plus 0.17. Now, these individual level correlations do not matter in our field. The only thing that matters is whether the 3 variables are correlated at the national level. By the way, they are correlated at the individual level, so this is not only fictitious, but also untrue. But the point is that it doesn't matter how they correlate at the individual level. What we are interested in is whether we have the following correlations at the national level. If we have these scores, 60, 65, 61, and so on, the 3 variables are obviously correlated at the national level. And then what will happen? Whether each of the bills will pass and become law does not depend on the individual level pattern, but on how the legislators and the population view each item separately. And if the items are correlated at the national level, then countries with a higher average score are more likely to have a permissive culture and be ready for Western democracy, as demonstrated by Welzel 2013. Moreover, there are various variables that are correlated at the national level, but not at the individual level. There are many examples. For example, humility and power seeking in Schwartz's research. In my own, adolescent fertility and paternal absenteeism are strongly correlated at the national level, and they predict homicide rates, but they cannot be correlated at the individual level because the first is a characteristic of women and the second of men. So they just cannot correlate. Looking for a correlation at the individual level is looking for something that cannot exist. And in a forthcoming article, together with Boris Sokolov, one of our most prominent critics, by the way, we find that the indicators of national individualism, collectivism, and those of flexibility monumentalism yield two orthogonal dimensions at the national level, but they split into 3+3 at the individual level. So if we study individualism, collectivism, for example, as a dimension of national culture, it's illogical to test for measurement invariance at the individual level, because at the individual level, we have something completely different. Three dimensions that do not combine into anything like individualism, collectivism at the individual level of analysis. So from the viewpoint of our field, testing for individual level invariance, when the targeted construct is ecological, is an example of an ecological fallacy known since Hofstadter's early work. It's like looking for something that's not supposed to exist. It's like studying individuals and assuming that they are structured like the cells of which they consist, or studying cells and assuming that they are structured like atoms. We're talking about different systems with different structures. And a recent example that I thought of recently, a football team may consist of fantastic players and yet perform subpar. Example, Barcelona 2016-17, they had some of the best players in the world, and their performance was unsatisfactory. And the reason is that the qualities of a football team are not the sum total of the qualities of each player. And the characteristics of a society's culture are not the sum total of the personalities of its members, which is what McRae thinks, but we think that he's wrong. On the specificities of the research methods of comparative culturology. While cross-cultural psychology tends to be consistent with a reflective paradigm, as described by various authors, we cite Coltman and associates, and with the realism research philosophy, our field tends to be consistent with a formative paradigm and an instrumentalism research philosophy. What does that mean? In the 1920s, when I lived in various Scandinavian countries, I observed that Scandinavians are kind and nice people, and I shared this with a friend of mine, a Swede. And she was surprised and thought, she thought there was something wrong with my observation. And my answer was, well, I think that I'm correct because Scandinavians talk politely and smile. And she said, first, kindness is much more than just that. And second, what you see is often artificial. Some store clerks are trained to smile and talk politely. And now I realized that she was thinking like a psychologist, and even back then I was thinking like what I am now. This brings up the question of how can we operationalize a construct such as kindness or anything else. Here I quote Bloch, one of the critics of the Big Five paradigm, who says that an infinite number of sets of descriptive variables can be formulated, each being preferred by its progenitor and contestable otherwise, meaning that there is nothing objective in these constructs. And also influential demonstrations of the sufficiency of the five-factor model may have been unduly influenced by prior pre-structuring of personality variables used in these analyses. Essentially, this means that you get what you what you get depends on how you design your research and your questionnaire. Since I don't have much time, I will skip this, but this is also an interesting point. In addition to the dominant Big Five models, a Big Five model of personality, there's also a Big Eight, Big Seven, Big Six, Big Four, Big Three, Big Two, and even a Big One. Which of them is the true one? Drawing sharp lines between constructs is an exercise in subjectivity. Honesty can be associated with Big Five, agreeableness, but equally or even more so with conscientiousness. So how do you draw the dividing lines between these constructs? Energy is typically associated with Big Five extroversion, but I found, and this is based on research in many countries, that it can also be associated with emotional stability. Now, I'm not really a personality psychologist, but look at this by three prominent personality psychologists. The first one is not Geert Hofstede. This is Hofstede without a D. All three of them are prominent personality psychologists. They apply something like Schwartz's method, circumplex analysis of the Big Five, and look what they get. They get something like Schwartz's circumplexes, but these are personality items, and they do what he does. They slice the pizza in accordance with some theory. But how objective is this? Why do some of the slices contain a couple of items while some contain up to 18 items? Where's the objectivity here? Now look at this. This is a picture of a sky full of stars. Do you see any objectively delineated constellations? The stars exist objectively, but how do we delineate constellations? We are familiar with the Babylonian zodiac, but the Mayan astronomers had a very different way of partitioning the sky into constellations, and Chinese astronomers in antiquity had yet another way of partitioning the sky. So how do we go about this task? It's impossible to be objective. So we can use some pragmatic principles. For example, we can pick something that is big and prominent. Why? Because this can have pragmatic utility. It can help us navigate by night at sea, for example. So from the viewpoint of our field, there's no such thing as an objectively existing, clearly delineated kindness constellation. There are many related or unrelated behaviors that may be commonly understood as acts of kindness, but which of them will be chosen as indicators of kindness is a matter of subjective preference. This doesn't mean that the choice is completely arbitrary. The kindness constellation should be theoretically acceptable and practically useful. It should yield good and useful prediction. If I decide to operationalize kindness in terms of polite talk and smiling, it's illogical to say that there's a truer kind of kindness. For instance, one that also includes generosity, because then I would ask, but why not add something else like help and whatever else? That would be saying like one constellation is truer than another, or that the African elephant is truer than the Indian rhino. However, a rhino may be less easy to tame or domesticate, and from that perspective, it may be more useful from a practical viewpoint. This thinking is not completely alien in psychology. We cite van der Maas and associates as saying that preference for one IQ index above the other may be a pragmatic issue that rests mainly on predictive value. As long as you don't claim that the IQ test reveals a general factor of personality rooted in biological differences, but use the personality test only to predict, for example, job performance, then the best IQ test is the one that gives you the best performance, the best prediction of performance. And we illustrate this. This is from Minkov and Casa. This was published in CrossCultural Research. Each green dot is an indicator from subjective culture study, questionnaire items, and each orange item is a national indicator, such as homicide rates, adolescent fertility. There's an infinite number of national indicators. Now you can plot them on top of each other and you get this circumplex. How do we position axes? Where would the factors run? How do we sequence this? It depends on what you would like to explain. If you want to explain specific phenomena associated with individualism, collectivism, and what I call flexibility monumentalism, this may be the best way to position the axes, the two thick diagonals. But if you're interested in something else, more closely associated with Engelhardt's secularism versus traditionalism and self-expression versus survival, then you may pick another dimensionalization of this space. It's all a matter of practical utility, plus, of course, theoretical coherence. If kindness is operationalized through polite talk and smiles, do we know that these are real and not faked? In our field, this question is irrelevant. Our reality is not what is hidden in people's brains. That's what psychologists study, and we don't. Our reality is what is expressed. What is relevant to us is whether expressed politeness results, for instance, in customer satisfaction. From our viewpoint, what is a happy society? It can be defined as a society in which a lot of people state that they're happy and a lot of people often smile and laugh. Could these statements, as well as the smiles, be different from what people feel? Of course. But then what is the problem? For cross-cultural psychology and any psychology, it may be that the indicators do not reflect the true trait. For us, the indicators may not yield good prediction. That's the problem. What is a religious society? Likewise, it's a society in which a lot of people state that they're religious and a lot of people follow religious practices, such as fasting, praying, and so on. Can all this be faked? Yes, and I have examples in my family. Two of my grandparents were atheists, but they followed some religious practices. However, if some people fake their religiousness, like my grandparents, that means that they feel social pressure to do so. If hardly anybody in that society is truly religious, then where would the pressure come from? Even in the unlikely event that we discovered a society in which most people are non-believers and still most people express religiousness, that still would not mean that one concept of religiousness is truer than another. We're just talking about different concepts. Which one is truer? We would never ask that question. We would ask which one gives better prediction in specific circumstances. So our field is mostly the study of overt behaviors, including verbal and written communication. In other words, our constructs are consistent with a formative paradigm in which a construct is a constellation of indicators with nothing latent, lurking in the depths of the mind. Our constructs normally consist of what is expressed, not what is suppressed deep in the mind. Why is it relevant to study what is expressed? There are studies that from organizational behavior that show that, for example, people like to work with happy colleagues. And how do they decide who is happy? Only on the basis of what is expressed, of course. Expressed happiness may predict effective team building, since happy employees perceived as happy receive more support. So it matters. What people express matters a lot. At the national level, expressed stated happiness correlates positively with expressed tendency to help others and with real suicide rates. So you, on the basis of what people express in verbal statements and behavior, you can predict other real behaviors. That's why it matters to study expressions. Now, some theoretical implications. Our field does not search for objectively existing latent factors that cause their indicators. A construct consists of its indicators, not of what is hidden behind them. And what follows from this is that there's no such thing as construct misspecification. The construct is what the researcher has specified. Constructs are a matter of design, not of discovery. Consistent with the formative paradigm, there is no error term in the classic sense, since there is no search of a hidden truth. The whole indicator may form or contribute to the construct, even if it contains social desirability. If it's socially desirable to say I'm religious, that means that we're dealing with a religious society in which it is important to express religiousness. Among other things, culture is what is socially desirable. So from our perspective, it makes sense to study what is expressed and what is equated with social desirability. Since collectivism is about conformism, which includes avoiding dissent, acquiescence may be part of it. A measure of collectivism cannot be contaminated with acquiescence, just as water cannot be contaminated with itself. If acquiescence is found in a measure unrelated to collectivism, then we have a problem. Then we agree with cross-cultural psychologists. But the problem for us is that the measure would probably lose some of its predictive potential. And so this should be avoided, but acquiescence should be avoided in this case, but for a different reason. A logical question: if there's no latent factor, what holds the indicators together? And we refer to van der Maas again and the so-called mutualism model, in which the indicators cause each other without anything latent behind them. And this is illustrated by the following graphs: a latent factor model in which there's something external, for example, GDP differences in red. They cause differences, individualism, collectivism, and differences, individualism, collectivism, the factor F in the middle, causes the indicators, whatever you use to measure individualism, collectivism. With the mutualism model, there are external, several, perhaps, external influences, which cause each of the indicators separately, and each of the indicators also cause each other. And there is no single latent factor that binds these indicators together. Does this mean that this new concept of our field as a study of overt behaviors and statements wipes out decades of studies viewing culture as consisting of values? I would say no. Since values guide behavior, behavior can be seen as a very imperfect indication of values. But what is a perfect indication of values? Perhaps brain scans. This is from a notorious brain scan of a dead salmon showing brain activity, demonstrating that brain scans, at least for now, are still notoriously unreliable. Even if brain scans were reliable, do you see any cultural values in this brain scan? I don't think that anybody would claim that even with a brain scan, you can directly observe happiness, religiousness, and so on. The closest that you can get is something like this. There are studies that show that when you feel anger, fear, all kinds of feelings, there are particular sections of the brain that are activated. So by looking at brain scans, you can more or less guess what people are feeling. And this technique will probably be perfected and improved in the future. So it might become, this might become quite reliable, guessing what people are feeling and thinking by looking at brain scans. But then this results in some practical issues to consider in future research. And I'm almost done. First, factor analysis based on shared variance, and especially confirmatory factor analysis, be it single group or multi-group, does not make sense in in comparative culturology, since nothing latent is supposed to exist. Only exploratory combinatory data reduction methods make sense, such as principal components analysis, multidimensional scaling, and hierarchical cluster analysis, as these do not exclude non-shared variants. And then why would we bother to do these analyses? Simply to simplify reality. If we have 25 or 50 different indicators measuring individualism, collectivism, it's simply easier to think of individualism, collectivism as an imaginary single entity, which is the sum total of all of these. It's something like the center point, but there's no assumption of a latent factor that causes these indicators. And then returning to these brain scans, if psychologists ever accept that brain scans and other physiological measures yield truer information than questionnaires, then the next step would be to find a methodology to control for all kinds of situational factors during these brain scans, and then compare samples from different societies on such brain scan measures. If it becomes, if there's some consensus that this provides true measures of what is in the brain, even though brain scans can also be faked. You can take various drugs to affect your state of mind. But let us assume that at some point it might be able to control for such interventions. And then the main question for us would be the same. I personally would accept, I would be very interested in having such measures of brain scans that measure how happy or religious or whatever people are from different countries based on brain scans. But then after we aggregate the brain scan measures to the national level, do these aggregate measures give us good prediction of anything? And are these predictions coherent with a convincing theory? So ultimately, it all boils down to this. Can we predict something about the way that societies differ from each other and how they will develop in the future? And do we have a consistent theory for that? And this is, yes, I'm finished.